Most people think belly fat is just about appearance, something you notice in the mirror or feel when your clothes get tight. But what if the fat around your waist was not cosmetic at all, and instead was a warning sign your body was under internal stress? That's the reality many people miss. The most dangerous fat is not the fat you can pinch under your skin. It's visceral fat, the kind that wraps itself around your liver, pancreas, intestines, and other vital organs. This fat is not quiet or inactive. It produces inflammatory signals, disrupts hormones, and increases the risk of serious disease. And the worst part is that most people are trying to get rid of it in ways that actually make it worse. One of the biggest misunderstandings about visceral fat is the belief that it comes only from overeating or lack of discipline. That idea sounds logical, but it's wrong. Visceral fat is not a willpower issue. It's a hormonal issue. Two hormones in particular control whether this fat accumulates or disappears, and they are almost completely ignored in mainstream advice. Those hormones are insulin and cortisol. Insulin's job is to store energy. Cortisol's job is to protect you when your body senses danger. When both of these hormones stay elevated at the same time, your body enters survival mode. In survival mode, appearance doesn't matter. Longevity doesn't matter. The only priority is staying alive. And the safest place to store energy when the body feels threatened is deep inside the abdomen, close to vital organs. This is why chronic stress leads to belly fat. This is why poor sleep does the same. This is why eating constantly throughout the day keeps the problem alive. It's also why extreme dieting and excessive exercise often backfire. When you slash calories while pushing your body harder, you send a powerful signal that food is scarce and danger is everywhere. The body responds by slowing metabolism, breaking down muscle, and fiercely protecting visceral fat. From the body's perspective, that fat is emergency fuel, and it will not give it up easily. Cortisol itself is not the enemy. You need it to survive. Acute cortisol is normal and healthy. The problem is chronic cortisol, the kind that stays elevated day after day. Chronic cortisol shuts down fat burning, worsens insulin resistance, and locks fat into the visceral compartment. This is why trying to lose fat by eating less and exercising more at the same time is often a mistake. That combination raises cortisol and reinforces the survival response. When the body feels under constant threat, fat loss becomes unsafe. Visceral fat loss begins only when the body feels safe again. That sense of safety is communicated through hormones. Insulin must come down. Cortisol must normalize. When that happens, the body no longer needs emergency energy storage and visceral fat becomes expendable. This pattern shows up repeatedly when insulin resistance improves and stress hormones stabilize. Visceral fat starts to shrink even before major weight loss appears on the scale. Blood sugar improves, triglycerides fall, fatty liver begins to reverse, and energy returns. The scale usually changes later after the internal repair is already underway. The key point is this: visceral fat is not a calorie problem, it's a signaling problem. If you want to remove it, you must stop telling your body that it's under constant threat. In the next part, we'll focus on insulin, why it is the primary driver of visceral fat, and why lowering insulin must be your first priority if you want real, lasting results. To understand why insulin matters so much, you have to stop thinking only about blood sugar and start thinking about insulin levels over time. Insulin is the body's main storage hormone. Every time insulin rises, fat burning does not slow down. It stops. As long as insulin remains elevated, your body cannot access stored fat, especially visceral fat. This is why focusing only on calories misses the real issue. Calories do not determine insulin levels. Food type and eating frequency do. Someone can eat very little and still have insulin elevated all day if the wrong foods are eaten or meals are spaced too closely together. Refined carbohydrates, sugars, and frequent snacking create a constant stream of insulin release. Eating every 2 to 3 hours, even if the portions seem small or healthy, prevents insulin from ever dropping low enough for fat burning to begin. This constant stimulation keeps visceral fat locked in place. Visceral fat is especially sensitive to insulin because fat cells around the organs contain more insulin receptors than subcutaneous fat. When insulin rises, Visceral fat responds faster and is defended more aggressively. This is why some people look relatively lean in their arms and legs, but carry a large belly and develop fatty liver at the same time. Another critical detail most people never hear is that insulin resistance does not start with high blood sugar. It begins years earlier with chronically high insulin, while blood sugar still appears normal on lab tests. During this silent phase, insulin is already driving visceral fat accumulation, inflammation, and damage to blood vessels. By the time blood sugar finally rises and gets attention, much of the damage has already occurred. This is why early intervention matters. The fastest way to lower insulin is not exercise supplements or eating fewer calories. It is eating less often. This is simple physiology. Every time you eat, insulin rises. When you stop eating, insulin falls. If insulin never has time to come down, fat burning never turns on. This is why grazing throughout the day is so damaging. Multiple meals, constant snacking, smoothies, bars, and sipping calorie-containing drinks all keep insulin elevated. The pancreas never gets a break, and the liver continues converting excess glucose into fat, much of which ends up stored viscerally. When insulin finally drops low enough, a shift occurs. Fat-releasing enzymes activate, stored fat begins to leave fat cells, and the liver starts burning fat and producing ketones. Visceral fat, because it is metabolically unstable, is often among the first fat stores to be mobilized. But this only works if insulin falls without cortisol rising. If fasting is combined with excessive exercise, aggressive calorie restriction, or chronic stress, cortisol increases. When cortisol rises, insulin resistance worsens and fat loss stalls. This is why the approach must be calm and intentional, not extreme. Time-restricted eating is one of the safest and most effective ways to lower insulin while keeping cortisol stable. By eating within a defined window and stopping food intake earlier in the evening, insulin is given several uninterrupted hours to fall, especially overnight. This allows fat burning to occur during sleep, which is when cortisol should naturally be lowest. Late-night eating disrupts this process. Eating at night raises insulin at the exact time it should be dropping, interferes with circadian rhythm, increases morning insulin resistance, and promotes visceral fat storage. Lowering insulin is necessary, but it is not sufficient on its own. Cortisol must also be addressed. In the next part, we'll look at how cortisol interferes with fat loss, why stress management is non-negotiable, and how chronic stress can block visceral fat loss, even when diet appears to be under control. Cortisol is often misunderstood as just an emotional stress hormone, but its role goes far beyond feelings. Cortisol is a survival hormone. Its primary function is to keep you alive during perceived danger by raising blood sugar, mobilizing energy, and breaking down stored tissue if necessary. In short bursts, this system works perfectly. The problem begins when cortisol stays elevated for long periods of time. When that happens, the body behaves as if it is constantly under threat, even when no real danger exists. In a state of chronic stress, fat loss becomes unsafe from the body's perspective. The body does not want to release stored energy when it believes survival may be at risk. Instead, it protects and often expands visceral fat because visceral fat provides fast, reliable energy during emergencies. This is why people under long-term stress often gain belly fat even without overeating. The body is responding to hormonal signals, not calorie intake. Cortisol directly raises blood sugar by stimulating the liver to produce glucose through a process called gluconeogenesis. When blood sugar rises, insulin follows. This means high cortisol indirectly drives high insulin. Even if food intake is low, chronic stress can keep insulin elevated and block fat burning. Because this sugar is produced internally rather than consumed, most people do not realize what is happening. They blame age, metabolism, or genetics, when the true issue is cortisol-driven insulin resistance. Sleep deprivation is one of the strongest triggers for elevated cortisol. When sleep drops below 6 to 7 hours, cortisol rises the next day. Appetite increases, insulin sensitivity declines, cravings intensify, and visceral fat storage accelerates. No diet can compensate for chronic lack of sleep. Without proper sleep, hormonal balance cannot be restored. Excessive exercise is another major contributor. Exercise is a stressor. In controlled amounts, it improves insulin sensitivity and metabolic health. In excessive amounts, especially when combined with calorie restriction, it raises cortisol and reinforces fat retention. This is why endurance athletes often struggle with stubborn belly fat. Despite high levels of physical activity, their bodies are in a constant state of stress. Irregular or chaotic fasting can also raise cortisol. Fasting is beneficial when it is planned and calm. Random stressful fasting, especially paired with high caffeine intake and poor sleep, signals danger to the body. The result is hormonal resistance rather than fat loss. The body responds by holding on tighter to visceral fat. To lower cortisol, the body needs predictability, safety, and recovery. This means consistent sleep and wake times, exposure to natural light during the day, regular eating patterns within a defined window, and reducing stimulation late at night. One of the simplest and most powerful ways to lower cortisol is to stop eating several hours before bedtime. When late-night eating stops, insulin falls, cortisol follows, growth hormone rises, and fat burning increases during sleep. Sleep quality improves, and metabolic repair accelerates. Emotional stress also plays a significant role. Chronic fear, anger, guilt, and anxiety are interpreted by the nervous system as ongoing threats. These emotional states keep cortisol elevated even when diet and sleep appear perfect. This is why relaxation, laughter, forgiveness, and social connection are not optional. They are metabolic tools that directly influence hormonal balance. With insulin and cortisol both addressed, the body finally receives a clear signal of safety. Only then does visceral fat become expendable. In the next part, we'll look at how to structure eating and fasting in a way that restores hormonal rhythm and promotes visceral fat loss without triggering stress responses. The goal of eating and fasting is not to punish the body, but to restore its natural hormonal rhythm. When hormones follow their intended cycles, visceral fat loss begins almost automatically. When those rhythms are disrupted, the body resists change no matter how much effort is applied. This is why it helps to stop thinking in terms of dieting and start thinking in terms of eating patterns. The human body did not evolve to eat continuously from morning until night. It evolved to alternate between periods of eating and periods of fasting. When food is consumed all day long, insulin remains elevated all day long. When insulin stays elevated, visceral fat stays protected. A simple and effective approach is time-restricted eating, where food intake is limited to a defined window, and fasting occupies the rest of the day. For many people, an 8-hour eating window works well, while others feel better with 6 hours. The most important factor is consistency, not extremism. Eating earlier in the day is especially beneficial. The body is more insulin sensitive in the morning and early afternoon. Eating late forces the body to process glucose when insulin sensitivity is naturally lower, making storage as visceral fat more likely. Finishing the last meal at least 3 to 4 hours before bedtime allows insulin to fall, cortisol to normalize, and growth hormone to rise during sleep. Growth hormone is one of the most powerful fat-burning hormones, particularly for visceral fat. What you eat when breaking a fast also matters. Meals should begin with protein and fiber. These slow digestion, stabilize blood sugar, and reduce insulin spikes. Highly refined carbohydrates consumed at the start of a meal raise insulin quickly and undo many of the benefits gained from fasting. This does not require perfection, but it does require awareness. Extended fasting is not appropriate for everyone. Long fasts can raise cortisol in individuals who are already under significant stress. In many cases, shorter, regular fasting periods produce better results and are easier to maintain. One common mistake is stacking stressors. People fast longer, exercise harder, sleep less, consume more caffeine, and restrict calories simultaneously. This combination signals danger and causes the body to cling to visceral fat even more tightly. A more effective approach is to reduce stress before increasing intensity. Improving sleep, eliminating late-night eating, lowering caffeine intake, and eating whole foods create a foundation of safety. Fasting can then be introduced gradually without triggering cortisol. Hydration also plays an important role. Dehydration raises cortisol and increases stress signals. Drinking adequate water during fasting supports circulation, reduces physiological stress, and improves fat mobilization. Visceral fat loss rarely follows a straight line. Some weeks the scale may not change, even though important metabolic improvements are occurring. Waist circumference often decreases before weight does. Blood sugar, triglycerides, and liver enzymes often improve first. These changes indicate that visceral fat is being mobilized internally, even if external changes take time to appear. Patience is essential. Visceral fat is dangerous, but it is also protective. The body will not release it until it feels consistently safe. That safety comes from stable blood sugar, regular sleep, low inflammation, and reduced stress. Occasional deviations do not reverse progress. What matters is the dominant pattern over weeks and months. With eating patterns and fasting properly structured, the next critical piece is movement. Not all activity supports visceral fat loss. In the next part, we'll explore how the right kind of movement accelerates fat loss without increasing cortisol, and why more exercise is not always better. Movement plays an essential role in visceral fat loss, but the type of movement matters far more than the volume. More activity does not automatically lead to better results. In fact, the wrong kind of exercise can slow progress by increasing stress hormones. Long-duration endurance exercise, especially when combined with calorie restriction, places the body under prolonged stress. Cortisol rises, energy conservation increases, and visceral fat is protected. This is why many people work harder and see fewer results. What works better is movement that improves insulin sensitivity without exhausting the nervous system. Resistance training is one of the most effective tools for this purpose. When muscles contract against resistance, they pull glucose out of the bloodstream without relying heavily on insulin. This reduces insulin demand and improves metabolic flexibility. Muscle tissue acts as a metabolic sink, safely storing and using glucose so it does not need to be converted into fat. Muscle is not just for strength or appearance. It is a metabolically active organ. The more functional muscle you maintain, the more resilient your metabolism becomes. This reduces strain on the pancreas, lowers insulin levels over time, and creates an internal environment where visceral fat is no longer needed. Resistance training also produces short, controlled stress, followed by recovery. That cycle strengthens the system rather than breaking it down. Brief sessions of higher intensity movement can also be useful when recovery is adequate. Short sprints, interval training, or brisk uphill walking activate fat-burning pathways and improve mitochondrial health. These sessions should be brief and infrequent, not daily marathons. The goal is stimulation, not depletion. When intensity becomes constant, cortisol rises and benefits diminish. Walking deserves special attention. Walking lowers cortisol, improves circulation, enhances insulin sensitivity, and supports digestion. It stimulates lymphatic flow and helps regulate appetite. Most importantly, it does all of this without activating the stress response. A daily walk, especially outdoors, is one of the simplest and most effective tools for reducing visceral fat. It supports recovery while reinforcing hormonal balance. Sleep and movement are closely linked. Poor sleep worsens insulin resistance and raises cortisol. Properly timed movement improves sleep quality. Exercise earlier in the day supports circadian rhythm, while intense late-night exercise can elevate cortisol and delay melatonin release. Timing matters as much as intensity. Breathing patterns also influence stress hormones. Chronic shallow breathing signals danger to the nervous system. Deep nasal breathing activates the parasympathetic system, lowering cortisol and promoting relaxation. Simple habits like nasal breathing during walks, slow breathing between tasks, and intentional pauses throughout the day create measurable metabolic benefits. Inflammation is another critical factor. Visceral fat is inflammatory, but inflammation itself promotes visceral fat storage, creating a self-reinforcing cycle. Reducing inflammatory inputs allows the body to break this loop. Ultra-processed foods, industrial seed oils, excess sugar, alcohol, and poor sleep all contribute to chronic inflammation. Removing these inputs gives the body space to heal. Alcohol deserves special mention. Alcohol raises cortisol, disrupts sleep, impairs liver fat metabolism, and worsens insulin resistance. Even small amounts can significantly slow visceral fat loss, especially when consumed in the evening. The liver plays a central role in managing visceral fat. When liver fat decreases, visceral fat follows. Improving liver health often leads to metabolic recovery before visible fat loss appears. With movement, sleep, and inflammation addressed, the system begins to work as intended. In the final part, we'll bring all of these pieces together and explain why consistency matters more than intensity, and how working with the body rather than fighting it leads to lasting visceral fat loss.